In the second part, we will look at the advantages of evidence based policy making, certain tools that are being used in evidence based policy making, and the application of evidence based policy making in the developing countries, particularly with reference to India, some of the limitations of this. Before we look into the advantages, it is pertinent for us to understand what are important characteristics, salient features of any evidence. There are four important characteristics. The first one is quality, accuracy, objectivity. What is this objectivity? As I have said earlier, that our policies are not supposed to be based on opinions. In other words, no public policy should be opinionated without substantial evidence for that. When you look at the quality of the data, what is the quality of data? How do you assess? The quality of data is known by its ability to be representing. Now, when you take the sample and that sample should represent, then only the data that we generate becomes very much valid. And now there are different techniques. So that is how when we talk about this data, this has a cross-cutting issues with research methods. Now, if you take a sample which is unrepresentative of a particular community or a category, then that is not acceptable to them. So, there are different methods of how we fix a particular sample, quota sampling, etc., etc. So, the important aspect of evidence is that it should not have a bias. There must be a criteria how we choose particular sample. So, that is what we mean by accuracy. Now, when the data is having the representativeness, then it will become accurate. So, simply taking a few individuals and applying it to the large communities is not acceptable in the scientific field. Second aspect is credibility of the data, very, very important. When we talk about credibility, who collected the data, how they collected the data, and what are their strengths and what are their what are their reputedness. Most of the time we see that certain NGOs collect the data which may not be fulfilling the qualities of a good data or evidence, because they may tend to fabricate the data or tilt the findings in such a way that they desire the research to be. So, therefore, some of the known research institutes, academic institutions are more relied upon compared to the NGOs. More importantly, when we see the line of argument of that research, it should be very strong and it should be very clear, and what is the argument of that report should be very clear. This is the second important aspects of evidence. Third important aspect is relevance. Every research is relevant in a particular context, in a particular time and space, and every research also has certain policy implications. Let us say, for example, if a disease breaks out in a particular city, now the research that is carried out at that particular point of time is very temporal and is very geographic specific, and it may be applicable to the other society or not. Nobody knows about that. So, therefore, the evidence should be clearly meeting the standards of this particular relevance part. And most importantly, if the research findings are generalizable, and then it can be relied upon, it can be trusted upon in the later findings also. And the last important aspect of that evidence is practicability. What do you mean by practicability? Any research that we carry out, as I have said, has policy implications. It must be accessible to the policymakers. So, the more accessibility, then the more quicker action that the policy implementers can do in the field. So, that is how these are very important aspects: relevance, then quality, generalizability. These are some of the important characteristics of evidence. Dear learners, let us look at some of the advantages of evidence in policy. Most importantly, evidence will try to establish link between the strategic goals of that program and the levels of achievement. As we see that the data clearly portrays the levels of achievement, it becomes crystal clear to the government about how that particular policy is being carried out. So, the gap between the strategic directions and the achievement of the policy goals can be bridged with this data driven research. And more importantly, the data driven research, in other words evidence based research, will try to bring open governments. Gone are the days where the governments keep all the data with them or hide the data from the public gaze. Now, we are moving towards the transparent governments. The governments are expected to be 24/7 to meet the challenges of the expected and unexpected demands of the citizens. So, therefore, the government should have the data on hands at fingertips. Say for example, a calamity, or for example, the recent phony storm in West Bengal or Odisha and other parts. As the government's national disaster management authorities are having the data with them, it becomes quicker for them to respond to the casualties in those states. So, therefore, one can clearly see to what extent the government becomes more responsive to the needs of the citizens. That is one of the important advantages of having the data driven research. And more importantly, the data also tells us about the policy environment. If you look at the systems theory, you see that a system works in a particular environment. So, what are the trends that are taking place in a particular system will become clear to the policy makers. So, accordingly they make changes to see how they should modify a particular policy, how to customize, how to tailor, how to bring up the tailor-made policies in this. So, these are some of the important. It brings transparency, it makes the government so open, and the citizens can demand the transparency from the governments, and more importantly, bureaucrats also will become responsible to the citizens. So, that is how data driven research or scientific data will provide some kind of advantageous situation to the citizens and to the government. Having seen some of the important advantages of data driven research, now let me tell you some of the tools, but not at length, but some of the tools that have to be used in this policy making. That the government intends to start an environmental project in a scheduled area where tribals are living. Now, the government is obviously supposed to make an assessment. Now, this assessment requires regional assessment, the assessment of the livelihoods and how these tribal communities are going to be affected by that particular course of action. Take for example, Narmada Bachao Andolan is a best example of that. Now, how the areas are going to be submerged, the question of livelihood, all these need to be taken into considerations. And the government is supposed to use tools to assess regionally and also make a comparison between a particular region and the other international context. Use the cultural context, whether a policy that is successful in one geography may be successful or may not be successful. So, right from the designing of the policy, context should be taken into consideration. Government also should take the different tools to assess the feelings of the communities. So, it is called sentiment analysis. Now, how do they feel if a particular project come up in their livelihood areas? So, most of the time we see that forest dwellers are deprived of their forest rights. All these things are some of the matters of concern. And then how we take the sentiments into the considerations. Now, rehabilitations is an important issue. Now, what was the earlier experience of the governments of such projects across India? In all these circumstances, evidence plays an important role to give better inputs to the government. More importantly, the government should also use different tools like pilot study and what is the mood of the nation, what is the mood of that particular community which is going to be largely affected. So, that is some of the important tools that pilot studies etc. are very important. So, the tools that are developed to engage with the stakeholders, communities, and apart from that, the government is also supposed to consult the experts on that particular matter, because these are the people, these are the bodies, it may be a civil society organizations which are working for them, they also need to be consulted. For example, the UPA government 1 and 2 took the help of a National Advisory Council in drafting right to information and right to employment, MNREJ. These are some of the important feedbacks that they get from the expert groups and expert bodies. So, that is how government can take the help of different bodies and stakeholders in coming up with a particular policy analysis. Now, having seen some of the advantages, characteristics of evidence, now let us turn to the application part of this evidence based policies, particularly in the developing countries. I have mentioned earlier that evidence based policy making has got its origin in UK, in the developed countries. Now, there is also a possibility of this application or replication of evidence based policies in developing countries. Say for example, in Tanzania, the bureaucrats used evidence to assess and estimates the poverty levels. Now, as a result, they were better informed about the outcomes of the anti-poverty programs. So, they were successful in reducing the poverty levels. In contrast to that, there are some governments which neglected the data on health, particularly AIDS. As a result, they have to pay a heavy price for neglecting the data on HIV AIDS. So, that is how it is better to be informed by the timely driven research. So, that is how not only in Africa, but even in Latin America and other societies require the data driven research. So, in nutshell we can say the data driven research will help in reducing the poverty levels and improving the health outcomes and bringing economic progress in a particular society. Now let us look at the application of evidence based policy in India. In India, this particular issue of evidence based is picking up since a decade. We find very few public universities are dedicating to the research on evidence based policies. Now, take for example, Center for Study of Law and Governance in Jawaharlal Nehru University and Department of Public Policy, Law and Governance in Central University of Rajasthan, and some other public universities are exclusively meant for carrying out research in the public universities. And we also have certain institutes like Indian Institute of Public Administration, and then IIM Bengaluru, IIM Ahmedabad are also giving some importance to these public policy programs, which are mostly evidence based research. Apart from that, we see some of the think tanks like Center for Policy Research and Takshashila, they are also carrying out research in addition to the recently established private universities. But in India, if you look at it is picking up. The one state that is notable example is Tamil Nadu, which conducts randomized studies from time to time in policy research. So, that is how they are trying to improve public service delivery. Like any other tool of a management, this particular approach of evidence based policies is also having certain limitations. Let us look at some of the important limitations. The first limitation is expertise. Not all societies, not all governments are well equipped with the human skills to carry out policy research, because it requires a lot of resources, financial resources, human resources. They may not be having that much expertise. Other important aspect is values. Though a particular government adopts or holds research, in one way or the other, they are influenced by the political values of that research. They tilt certain findings of the research. So, that is how they may be having the political color of that government. In that sense, the evidence is no more objective as such, and their beliefs in their political ideologies will tend to influence the research findings. So, that is how we see that some of the think tanks that are reputed are more political in nature. So, the values and beliefs and the traditions influence the policy research. And other important aspects is lobbyists, pressure groups, consultants. Though they appear to be scientific, in one way or the other, they also come up with either pro-government or anti-government according to the circumstances. So, these are some of the limitations when they carry out a research. Though theoretically speaking, that all research is supposed to be scientific and unbiased, the party ideas and ideologies for the sake of winning elections will to some extent interfere their research findings. So, these are some of the important limitations of this. However, we can say that the evidence is almost played an important role in the digital society. So, one cannot undermine the importance of data driven research in the 21st century. Dear learners, I would like to throw some light upon context here. Context is a limitation. Now, you all may be knowing that Frederick said that ecological approach plays an important role in making a particular policy successful or not. Some societies are always driven by war-like situations, political volatility. Now, mostly you see in Sudan and other countries, you have insecurities. In such conditions, one cannot expect that the government carries out a research which is very scientific in nature. So, the context plays very important role. So, what is true in case of X region may not be true in case of region Y. So, therefore, context plays an important cultural, social, political, and more importantly, we require some of the important freedoms. The freedom that is to be granted to the academics without becoming biased to a political party, very important one. The other one is media also should be given a free hand to carry out research which is unbiased. And we see in and day out, even in the developed countries, that the media is being attacked for becoming so transparent in publishing or bringing out the news. And civil society groups, in one way or the others, they are being harassed for raising the issues which may not be in favor of a particular government. So, that is how even whistleblowers become very fearful in that. So, in the absence of academic freedom, media freedom, civil society freedom, we cannot expect a research which is unbiased. So, in all these circumstances, research in one way or the other is driven by certain values and beliefs. Dear learners, in this particular lecture titled Evidence Based Policy Making, we try to understand what is evidence, what are important qualities of an evidence, how evidence informs policy makers, what are the advantages, what are the limitations. Now, evidence is something that is scientific. Evidence is something that is research driven, and that research is systematically carried out without compromising the scientific tools and methods. Evidence can be ranging from a text to the photograph. The importance of evidence in policy making is that it brings accountability, it helps the government to make policy corrections and to put the policy onto the track, and there are different tools being used. For example, regional assessment, community assessment, community engagement, pilot studies. The concept of evidence based policy making was popularized by the Tony Blair government in the mid 1990s in UK, which said that policies should have a long term goal that should be supported by evidence rather than being succumbed by the political pressures. Evidence should have certain important qualities like accuracy, generalizability, relevance, quality, etc., etc. And evidence based policies will bring better outcomes. It will be useful mostly to reduce poverty, improve health outcomes. Evidence based policy tries to bridge the gap between policy and performance, and evidence based policy can also be used in the countries like India. So, in India it is becoming popular since a decade. And like every approach, this approach also has certain disadvantages because the cultural context and values in a particular societies, beliefs, resource crunch, traditions, political volatility, lack of freedom to academic community, civil society, these are some of the important limitations of that. So, in spite of all this, that evidence based policies is still very important to make a better policy in the 21st century. I hope you understood the lecture. For further details, you can refer to the readings at the end of the lecture. Thank you.